We're talking about the digestive system now. And when we're thinking about the digestive system, in some ways, the digestive system is really approachable because a few times a day you're going to be eating, and maybe once a day you'll be getting rid of what you ate. So, in some ways, it's approachable, but you should know me by now. This is AP 120. So we will be talking about biochemistry and proteins. And in particular, we'll be talking about some really interesting enzymes. But let's start with the basics. Your digestive tract does basically four things. The first thing that it does, we will call ingestion. Ingestion is taking a bite of food, perhaps chewing it, but making it so that you can swallow it. So that's the first step. The first step is ingestion. When it comes to health problems, people who are disabled and the elderly can sometimes have trouble with their nutrition because of step one. If it's very difficult or uncomfortable for people to chew and swallow healthy foods, perhaps because their teeth are bad or because their mouth is particularly dry, then they will choose less healthy foods to eat. Right? So step two, digestion. Now, digestion, that's a word that you might just use in regular English, like, oh, I'm going to wait for my dinner to digest, something like that. But when it comes to AP 120, we're talking about physiology, and it has a more precise definition. And you should know it for the final exam. Digestion is the breakdown of nutrients into absorbable molecules. I do remember back when we used to meet in person and I made you sit in that auditorium, and there was a time when you had to learn that carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids were huge molecules that are properly described as polymers because they're made of repeating subunits that are called monomers. And I asked you to memorize that proteins were polymers made up of monomers called amino acids, and carbohydrates are polymers made up of monomers that are called sugars or monosaccharides. Well, that's going to come back in this particular lecture. The oatmeal that I just ate, it won't be absorbed into my bloodstream until the starch in the oatmeal gets broken down into the individual monomers, the sugar molecules that were put together at one point by the oatmeal plant in order to build its larger starch. Then we have got absorption. There's no point in putting it into your mouth, swallowing it, breaking it apart, if it can't be taken up into the bloodstream. And getting it ultimately into the bloodstream where the cardiovascular system, your transportation system, can distribute it to different cells in the body. There's no point in doing the first two if you can't do the absorption. And then the last one, defecation. Defecation also has got greater meaning than what you might assume. Out of all of the stuff that we ingest, a lot of it we can digest into its monomers, but not everything. There are parts of the food that we consume that we cannot break down into monomers. And since those cannot be broken down, they cannot be absorbed. And so we got to get rid of it to make room for more food coming through. And that getting rid of the undigestible portion, that is called defecation. So let's talk a little bit more about digestion, because quite a number of questions on the exam are going to be about the digestion process. First of all, you should know that the concept of digestion of our food gets broken down into two main categories. One category is mechanical digestion, and the other category is chemical digestion. Mechanical, chemical, right? What is mechanical digestion? Well, mechanical digestion is not biochemistry. Mechanical digestion, anything like a really good blender could take your food and do mechanical digestion, right? So you have not broken apart individual molecules with a blender, but you have taken big chunks of food and pureed it into something that the enzymes that the body makes can work on. So you should know that mechanical digestion in humans, it starts in the mouth because we will take a bite of food and generally we will also chew that food. Okay. Now, there are certainly times when we don't chew our food very well. So thank goodness the stomach is also very good at mechanical digestion. Where does mechanical digestion stop? Well, it really depends on the textbook that you're reading. Some textbooks still consider there to be mechanical digestion in the intestinal tract. For our class, we are going to assume that mechanical digestion starts in the mouth, and by the time the stomach is done with the food and is moving it into the small intestine, we're going to consider mechanical digestion basically done. All right, chemical digestion. Chemical digestion is actually the breakdown of individual molecules. There are some very huge carbohydrates that make up the structure of the wall of plant cells, for example, that the acid in your stomach will break down chemically. But most of what we're talking about when we're talking about chemical digestion, we're talking about what enzymes do. And you had a whole lab on enzymes. You know that enzymes are almost always proteins, that enzymes are small proteins that will either grab a molecule and rip it apart or grab a couple molecules and put them together to make something bigger. The proteins and the carbohydrates that are in the food that you eat, at one point they were made by cells, their enzymes taking monomers and putting them together. Great. And now you've eaten protein, and now you've eaten starch. And those are going to go down into your intestinal tract, and a whole different set of enzymes is going to take those polymers and break them back apart into their individual monomers. It's almost like, you know, those pop beads that kids have, that one person was in charge of popping them all together, and then you had yourself a protein, and then you give it to the intestinal tract, and it pops them all apart, okay? Oh, here's something important. Chemical digestion in humans also starts in the mouth. Yeah, in your saliva, there is an enzyme, enzymes in the saliva, there is an enzyme that will start the digestion of complex carbohydrates before the food even gets down into your stomach. So for humans, chemical digestion starts in the mouth. The enzyme that breaks down starches is also found in the saliva of dogs, but your cat does not have that enzyme in her saliva. So if you ever wanted to know definitively whether it was your dog or your cat that chewed up your shoe, it was the dog. But if you ever wanted to know definitively, you could just check for the presence of that enzyme in the saliva, and you could have powerful evidence. We will be talking about the acid and enzymes in the stomach. We will be talking about the enzymes from the pancreas. We also will be talking about what that green stuff called bile that the liver makes. We'll be talking about its job as well. All righty, so absorption. Those individual monomers that your enzymes are going to break down the polymers into, those are the monomers that will get absorbed. So you should remember, hopefully, but it was a long time ago, that the proteins that are in your food, they will not be absorbed until any individual protein molecule gets broken down into individual amino acids. And proteins in general are made out of hundreds of amino acids. So if I fed you one myoglobin molecule, you would be eating thousands of amino acids. And the enzymes need to cut that down until you just have those monomers. The carbohydrates in your food cannot be absorbed until they're broken down into monosaccharides. This is kind of interesting because you know that stuff sugar that we put into a beverage, that is not a monosaccharide. Table sugar is a disaccharide. And even table sugar needs to be popped into its two monosaccharides before it can be absorbed by the body. The fat that's in our food will not be absorbed until it's broken down. Remember, when we're talking about fat, we're mostly talking about triglycerides. So I should probably state that here. But triglycerides get broken down into monoglycerides, so a glycerol with just one fatty acid, and then fatty acids. All right, one of the things that I hope that you will have learned by now from your lab is the pathway of digestion. Make sure that you know the pathway of digestion. So we will start by putting food into our mouth, then it will go into our pharynx. The pharynx has got, for the digestive tract, includes the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx, but for the digestive tract, we don't really consider the nasopharynx a part of it. Oh, another thing for the final exam. Remember that the pharynx is the part of your anatomy that gets shared by your digestive system and your respiratory system. From the pharynx, food is going to go down the esophagus, not meant to go into the larynx, right? It goes down the esophagus, and the esophagus carries it through that muscle called the diaphragm and into your stomach. The entry door to the stomach is the lower esophageal sphincter. The exit door from the stomach is called the pyloric sphincter. After the stomach, things go into the small intestine. You should know the three parts of the small intestine in order. And in order, the first part is the duodenum. And yes, some people pronounce it duodenum. I don't care. The second part is the jejunum. And the third part is called the ileum. Make sure you know the right order. Some students have shared with me that the way they memorize the order of the small intestine is they think of like the world's nerdiest DJ would be DJ ileum. Ileum. Oh, I spelled it so badly. That is supposed to be an E. Okay, DJ ileum. It looks like BJ ileum. DJ ileum, the world's least popular DJ. And the D stands for duodenum or duodenum, the J stands for jejunum, and then the ileum, all right? So the first place that food goes when it leaves the stomach is into the duodenum, then it'll go into the jejunum, then it'll go into the ileum, right? Now, the exit door from the small intestine is called the ileocecal valve, and that's because it is between the last part of the small intestine, the ileum, and the first part of the large intestine, which is called the cecum, the ileocecal valve. That is the door between the small intestine and the large intestine. The large intestine is known as the colon, so those are both correct terms. Large intestine and colon. The large intestine starts with a dead-end street called the cecum. Hanging off of the cecum is the appendix. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about it. The colon's got the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon. Then there's this little S-shaped part called the sigmoid colon. Then the rectum. The rectum is really just storing fecal matter until it's convenient to get rid of it, and then the anus. All right, we'll start there at the beginning of the next lecture.